She graduated from the Australian Film, Television, Radio School, AFTRS, in Sydney, and won the AWMI Indigenous Award at AFTRS. This is, you've just seen, her first feature film, Innocence Betrayed. She's written and produced several short films with several more in the offing. She and her husband Michael Lavache run michaellavacheproductions.com.au, so you can go off and read more. I'm going to finish the little bio and lead into a question. I've got a few questions for Larissa and invite you to ask some. Interestingly, on the Lavache Productions website, with the work that you've got there, you say that you make stories of social justice, you tell stories of social justice, stories of Indigenous Australia, stories that inspire and stories that provoke. And I think we've just seen a story that might do any one or all of those. Why did you make the film? Inspire, provoke?
Well, actually, as I said in the film, I got involved with the community after they approached me, and I'd been aware of this case. As you might have picked up, these murders happened in 1990, 1991. So I was still a law student, but the Aboriginal community was still very aware, like we were very aware of this case. When the families say if this had have been white people, that was kind of something that everyone knew. And most of you are too young to remember that time, but that's actually the time when the Royal Commission was just finishing off its determination. So all of the policing practices into Aboriginal deaths in custody. So a lot of the policing practices, that historical relationship between the community and the police that we talk about, was something that that Royal Commission looked at and you know, was really instrumental in making some changes to the way those perceptions were then to how they would be now. And so I think for those of us who were sort of aware of the Royal Commission, and one of the things it found was that Aboriginal people were overrepresented because they were locked up for basically street offences, offensive language, swearing, resisting arrest, drunk and disorderly in public. Locked up for that, you've got a white guy who murders 3 kids and basically you can't get him in court, you can't convict him. So there was sort of always something about this case. So when Arnie Elaine first approached me, I was really interested to get involved with it. And most of the work that I had done for them was working with them around these issues of why the Attorney General's Department was so resistant about getting these cases back into court. So you would have seen from the film, they lobbied to get the double jeopardy laws overturned, which was a hugely controversial thing. Everyone from the international jurists to the Law Society, the Bar Association, were for good reasons really against overturning that law. But if you go back and look in Hansard, one of the clear reasons why they decided to overturn that legislation was because of this case. It says it in Hansard. So imagine their surprise when that happens. They did this extraordinary thing overturning this common law principle, and they can't get this case back into court. So it was about that time that I really got involved. So most of the work that we did was really quite technical around looking at those issues. And one of the things that the families that we were working with had said was that nobody ever pays any attention to us unless we're in the media. And one thing that they say often were things like, you know, with all the sympathy they have and understanding, because they probably know better than anyone else, what it must have been like for Daniel Morecambe's parents. It used to confound them that they would see marches in the street and the Queensland Premier would turn up to support the families. This huge fight, no one ever told them you should get over it, give up, it's too hard. And then they would have these rallies and no one would turn up. And you could see from Arnie Mooney at the end saying, you know, the Attorney General, he should come and talk to me. He made these decisions without ever once talking to the family. And you couldn't imagine that in other high-profile cases of children going missing that there'd be such indifference. So one of the things that they had picked up, you know, and as you saw, they're very grassroots, down-to-earth people, very sort of savvy in a way. They've overturned legislation, but they don't have a lot of resources. They said the only time we ever get attention is when we're in the media. It's hard for us to get any media, but the 2 occasions we've sort of had, they had an Australian story that was done about a doctor who was working peripherally with them, and there was a Four Corners thing done earlier about Evelyn's case that interviewed the grandmother who had heard the crying in the night. And at those 2 times there'd been a shift in the cases. So they'd kind of picked up that they needed to do this, and it was their idea to do this film. So we had a lot of negotiation with them. They were really instrumental in it. Uncle Thomas had never done an interview before, and neither had Arnie Becker, Evelyn's mum. So their involvement with the film just wouldn't have happened. So it wasn't like we thought, oh, this is a really big story about injustice, we'll go in and we'll make a documentary. We'd actually worked a really long time with them, and they were very instrumental in how we shaped the documentary.
So is this film part of a campaign?
But it is part of the campaign. So as part of, you know, all of this, we've had the parliamentary inquiry underway, which started out just as we finished making the film. There's a parliamentary inquiry which is looking into what the impact of the cases not being resolved has had on the community. They're the terms of reference. You can see they're quite narrow, and they've been quite clear to say that they won't revisit the decisions of the Attorneys General as part of that, the two decisions. But I think, you know, having worked with the committee, that might be different. But this documentary was also, it aired earlier this year at about the time that inquiry was being heard. So they've been quite savvy. It's re-airing tonight, as it turns out.
It's 8:30 on National Indigenous television.
You know, as the committee's still thinking about its decision, but it was part of their campaign to, you know, to do that. And I guess the thing that we thought, just as lawyers, is that, you know, we've spent a lot of time dissecting the legal arguments, that whole thing about fresh and compelling, which we could talk about in a bit more detail. But at the end of the day, one of the biggest, you know, drivers for these kind of cases is public pressure on politicians who have that decision to make about whether this case goes back to court. And it doesn't really matter what kind of very eloquent legal arguments we might make around the rightness or wrongness. You're not going to find a more compelling argument than when you hear parents talk about that. And I think the other thing, just as an aside, that I'd say, I guess just as a lawyer who got into doing law to make social change. I mean, Simon and I both started out at Legal Aid. We've both, it's kind of what's driven us as academics as well, is you go in to make these changes, and you often find yourself advocating for people who are powerless. But I think the thing about integrating new media as a part of how you do litigation or law reform is that you can actually give voice to people who don't otherwise get that voice. And by sort of empowering them, you can kind of just make the argument stronger.
I wanted to ask you about that because, as campaigners for law reform, I think on the one hand, we are steeped in the technical side of law, and I understand how criminal trials work, and I understand why people get committed, and I understand rules of evidence. On the other hand, we believe in the personal journey that people are on. And a strictly legal view would be, and the attorney might say, the sympathy I have is one thing, but the technical brief I have from the DPP is another. And while I would like to give them comfort and closure, I am not going to run a case that I don't think has technical merits. Now that, I infer, is what happened here. This is a technical decision.
Yeah, but what's interesting about this case, I mean, this would feel very different if it was just the community saying, we think we know who it is and we think there's enough to go back into court. But I think what's really different about this case is that you not only have the community saying that, you have the police, some of the state's best homicide detectives are saying, we've run cases where there are no bodies and we think this has enough evidence to get over the line. We think there's enough evidence. It's kind of one of the inspiring things about this story is that you start off with this being the community against the police, and actually now they are, real co-conspirators in trying to get this back in. And you have a whole range of other legal experts who've looked at it. They've had barristers, criminal barristers. This is a case where there is split opinion. And I guess what's confounding to the families is they see cases, murder cases, where there is a lot less evidence, where there are no bodies, and there's not this kind of, tenuous sort of, oh, well, we don't want to go hard on it. People run cases all the time in a way that is aggressive and that runs the case at its highest. And if the families actually say, if it goes back into court and the case is run properly, and they don't get the right outcome, at least they'll feel like they've had their day in court and they've been heard.
Do you want to say or speculate why it's not happening?
Oh, I can talk about that quite openly. And one of the reasons we didn't go into that in the film is because we weren't really making it for law students or lawyers, and the technical stuff is quite technical. So the test is that the evidence has to be fresh and compelling. So with the Norco Corner evidence, which obviously is very compelling for all the reasons that Detective Inspector Jumbunna says, the Attorney General's position is because that evidence was around at the time that Clinton's first trial occurred, that evidence is not fresh. It might be compelling, but it's not fresh. And what we didn't put in the film is that there's also other evidence that is around which, when Hart was on remand in prison for awaiting trial for Clinton's murder, he confessed to the murders to 4 inmates individually. All of those inmates were on remand. None of them were convicted. None of them did plea bargains or anything. Their conversations were independent but very consistent. And there was things that aren't in the film, that aren't in the public domain, that they said, which you know, was also very instrumental in terms of, you know, figuring out that they probably did hear a confession. And the position on that evidence from the Attorney General is, well, yes, it is fresh because it wasn't obviously around at the time of the trial, but it's not compelling because it's inmate evidence. And of course there's a lot of mixed view around that. And the other thing that's kind of got them really hooked up on why they won't get it back into court isn't necessarily because of the evidence that is now available. The legislation says that evidence isn't fresh if it's been adduced. Now, the Norco Corner evidence has never been heard in a court case, but there was an attempt to introduce it into Evelyn's trial, but it was rejected. Actually, another sad irony for the families is that the rules around tendency evidence were very different at the time. Now, if you had a judge hearing this case, they would let the evidence in because those things have changed, but it's been the fate of this case that they've often been a step behind those kind of changes that might have helped them. So, you know, I think they look at that and think, why is it that it's this hang up on what the word adduced means?
Putting all on notice, I have one question, then I'll come to you. So
all right.
That's my question. The unspoken question here is, if it would happen for somebody else, why is it not happening for these people? Why is a more robust decision not being made now when it would be made for someone else? Is there...
That's their question, and I don't think they've had an answer to that.
Do you have an answer?
Well, I think they're right. I think if they had have been white, and Gary Jubilant says that too. He said when he first came into this case in 1997, he said, everyone said to me, race plays a factor in this, and I laughed it off. I thought, you know, there's no way that's right. But as he has worked on this case for all this time, he says it's absolutely right. And he feels that, I mean, he works on cases where there aren't Indigenous victims, and he feels the tenacity with which, and he'll name high-profile cases where they've gone hard with much less evidence. And he feels that he gets resistance along the way. So, you know, you can sort of, it's not that the police should be the validation of everything, but it's easy to dismiss the families or, you know, even us softy academic lefties of being, you know, soft-hearted about this. But when you're able to kind of get a validation from pretty hard-nosed people who wouldn't set you up to fail. I remember anyone who plays with a straighter bat than Gary. I mean, it's one of the reasons I think the families grew to trust him so much was that he would never tell them anything that wasn't true, wouldn't promise them anything he couldn't deliver, so they trust him. And, you know, when he says that, then you think, well, you know, you're not just making it up.
Some questions? Anybody? Yes.
So in the film you present this kind of small town, second-class citizen attitude. Do you think that's endemic in Australian society as a whole? Or is that very particular to that?
It's an interesting question. I mean, Bowraville's a very interesting town. It was one of the towns that was on the freedom rides that Charles Perkins did. And it's quite well, that's I guess in a way notorious during that time. It had a cinema where, you know, they had separate places, almost like the Deep South you hear in the United States, where you have separate places for the blacks and the whites. And Arnie Elaine in the interviews went into that history in a lot more detail than that. And so you get there now and you sort of saw the imagery we took around the town. It's so beautiful and scenic, but you sort of don't have to scratch much under the surface. And there is a really long history there. I mean, so, you know, I think in a lot of those places where you have families that have been there for decades, it's really hard to just be removed from that history. I mean, Auntie Elaine grows up in a time when there is segregation in her school and there is segregation when she goes to the cinema. And you can't imagine that now that's not a part of how she sees the world. It's not like you just forget that. But I think it's a really important thing in terms of how, you know, the police and the courts and people making decisions start to view it, you know. Certainly it's not like it was back then. And a lot of the strong supporters on the case are now non-Indigenous people in the town, you know. But you still get that sort of undercurrent of, you know, this is a problem for the blacks, you know, if they weren't drinking, if they didn't run amok on the reserve, you know, that there's still that kind of element of those real racist things, which is not actually just something in Bowraville. That is something that you find everywhere. You can find that in Redfern as much as anywhere else. So, you know, I don't think it's exceptional, but I think what it does highlight is, you know, you sort of talk about there was that history all those years ago, so why should it matter now? And actually it kind of does, yeah. You need to be aware of that. I think one of the things Gary did well was he went in and he kind of, once he sort of got to know the community, he did acknowledge that history was there, and it kind of made everyone feel validated and like he got it. You know, it helped build the trust they had with him. Thanks.
It's just like what was Jay Hart? Was he white?
Yeah.
And how long did he live in the town for?
Well, he'd had a long, he'd had a de facto relationship with Colleen's aunt when he moved there. So he'd been there for several years. That had broken down. So he was living near the mission, but he wasn't far from. It's a couple of streets away. Bowraville's not a very, very big town, you know. You can walk one into the other in about 10 minutes. But you could see from the film, he used to bring drugs and alcohol onto the reserve. So one of the things that came out in, you know, when you sort of say, well, why did the cases not succeed? There were all those things that were raised about the fact that the kids disappeared during parties, there was drinking going on, so people's memories were questioned. The community actually felt that their lifestyle was on trial a bit because, you know, the kids all disappeared during parties or while they were drinking. I mean, Clinton wasn't at a party, but he and his girlfriend were drinking in Hart's caravan, and, you know, they were 16 years old. So there was a lot of that kind of judgment. But, you know, I've worked in law for a long time, and I did many years on the Serious Offenders Review Council, and I did a lot of work through that with sex offenders. And the thing about them is they go to dysfunctional communities because that's where it's easiest for them to find people. And it's not necessarily that this was because they were black, and even the families say that. He didn't prey on this community because they were black, he preyed on them because they had levels of dysfunction, because there was drinking. And in that environment where people take drugs and they take alcohol, that's when predators thrive. You know, they always find these places. So, you know, he had maintained relationships with the community by supplying drugs and alcohol.
Were they able to find out what he used to actually spike the drinks at all?
No, I'm not sure that at least I'm not sure that they have. Yeah.
I just have a question on law reform and social justice with media as well. And I watched the Four Corners report on this matter. And there was also a Four Corners report earlier this year on the disappearance of an Indigenous boy a couple of years ago who was 8 years old in similar circumstances where evidence was just discounted because the police just considered that he'd gone walkabout.
Yeah.
So my question is in relation to, do you think that when, in terms of making this film and getting media, that once you start, it's really hard to try and push for social justice issues when we have a film or we have a really compelling story like the Four Corners one, and then it just disappears out of the public's mind because all these other stories come up? And does that make it harder for social justice to try and campaign these issues through the media?
That's a good question. And I'd say this, I mean, I think the thing about this film that's important to think about is we didn't just think the way to get justice in this case is to make a film. I think if you're interested in law reform, you kind of have to think of it as a much bigger matrix of things. So you've got to fight the legal issues and the people who are getting hung up on the word adduced and do all of that kind of much more technical legal stuff, and you do that kind of advocacy. But then there is a side of it that's about getting the human story across and making the general public feel something for this case. And that's a challenge the family sought in this, because they wonder why people feel things for Daniel Morecambe's family, quite rightly, but then don't feel it for them. So they feel that need. And I know Simon did the 3-part CV, but even, I mean, I guess for me, I always saw the writing of the novels. I mean, Simon mentioned what they were about. One was about looking at stolen generations, and one was about looking at the legacy of the 1970s human rights movement, the tent embassy on my generation. But they were really, to me, also ways of, when you're doing I guess the legal arguments of law reform, there's also a hearts and minds issue as well. And politicians are a result of the community, or a product of the communities that vote them in, and they respond to the issues that communities feel strongly about. And so I just think as your strategy kind of has to be bigger than that. It's holistic. I always see the storytelling and the law reform as kind of, you know, really linked. But I do think that perhaps, you know, the promise of new media, as I said, I started off doing novels, and I think, you know, they've been great in their own way, and one was on the VCE list in Victoria, so poor students had to study it. So, you know, you can get the stories out, but I think the thing about integrating new media, which is really exciting, is that you can actually have a much deeper penetration on issues into a much deeper audience. And I guess the other thing about them too that I've sort of touched on is it's such a powerful way of giving people who our system gives no voice to at least a bit of a voice. As I said, Uncle Thomas has never done an interview before. And the interesting thing about the film, really, and I don't take any credit for this because we didn't plan it, when the parliamentary inquiry came around, Auntie Becca and Auntie Muriel couldn't sit down to, they have to do a written submission. So we were doing written, obviously this is a community that doesn't have a lot of literacy skills, so we were sitting down, Leonie and I, helping people write their submissions out. But they would not sit down and do them. Like, they'd be out, like, we'd make an appointment, they'd be out of town, or, you know, try and trick them into turning up, and they'd outsmart us. And it sort of dawned on me that, quite rightly, they didn't want to sit down and relive this thing again. So we said to them, why don't we just take what you said in the film and transcribe it and make it into a submission, and then we'll put that in for you. So it was in their own words. And they were really happy and relieved. So there's just, I mean, like I said, I didn't think about that when we planned it, but the ways in which you can continue to empower the disempowered. At the end of the day, these families want justice for their children. They'll say that. That's what they've said to the inquiry. They said, we don't really, there's lots of things you could do for Bowraville, but we don't get justice until this guy's behind bars. But if part of their thing, of their pain is compounded because no one listens to their story, the fact that people have listened to it now is a really big deal for them. So, you know, I think we've, if anything, we've underestimated the extent to which new media can be a huge tool in the armoury of any kind of advocacy or law reform.
Sadly, I'm anxious to get Larissa onto her phone. And those of you who live in Canberra would know 34 minutes is running pretty close. So, could you please join me in thanking Larissa very much?